Well, I thought what I would do today, I have some slides up there, but I don't put my talk on slides. I have slides there in case I want to refer to any of them. They're maps and things like that. So I may come back to them depending on how things go or what your questions are. But I'll talk about something slightly different. What I thought I would do is refer to something that Bob talked about, which is that there's now a reevaluation going on in Washington about the objectives that the United States is trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And of course, it's a broader question than that, because the international operation in Afghanistan is not just a United States operation. It was started by the U.S. as a military operation after September 11th, but there was an ongoing United Nations and humanitarian operation in Afghanistan before that, which had gone back to the period of the Soviet invasion in the 1980s. And that then became joined up and transformed by the American military intervention. Today, Afghanistan is very much a multilateral operation internationally. In that respect, as in many others, quite different from Iraq, in that it's true that the largest troop contributor and the largest supplier of funds is the United States, but the UN has a major presence both through its political office and its specialized agencies. The government of Afghanistan, in its current version, developed out of an interim government that was put together at UN-organized talks that were held outside Bonn, Germany in 2001, where I was present as an advisor to the head of the UN delegation, Lakhdar Brahimi. The military operation, most of it, not all of it, is led by NATO, which is NATO's first deployment outside of the European theater, and there are other non-NATO countries that are participating in it. The World Bank is there, the IMF, all of the regional countries. In fact, virtually any international entity you can think of is present in Afghanistan. Now, this has both advantages, which were more apparent earlier on, and disadvantages, which have become more apparent later, in that it provided the operation with a great deal more legitimacy than a unilateral operation like the one in Iraq. And, of course, that is a reflection of the circumstances under which it started. But it also means that it's much more difficult to manage. Now, another issue, I just want to flag it, because we do tend to discuss in the United States, except in certain academic circles, we tend to discuss issues like this in terms of foreign policy or strategy, our interests, what our objectives are there. Of course, there are people who actually live there, and they have their own objectives, which may or may not coincide with ours, and they spend a lot more time thinking about what we want than we do thinking about what they want, because their lives and livelihood may depend on it. And they have their own ideas not only about what they want, but also about what we want, which often are quite different from what we think we want, just as what they want is often quite different from what we think they want. And then besides the people who live in Afghanistan, of course, there are the people in the neighboring countries and many other groups of people, because the population of Afghanistan, the economy, the society, and so on have become quite thoroughly globalized. Just because someone lives in a village without electricity doesn't mean they're living in the 18th century. They're not. Anyway, they do have electricity. They just, maybe it's in batteries or it's from generators, and they're not on a grid. But it is quite a thoroughly globalized country now, and I'll come back to that, and that makes a huge difference in what it is possible to do there. Nonetheless, I'm saying that just to signal in advance that though I am going to approach this to some extent from the point of view of foreign policy, I am certainly aware that there are other ways of approaching it, and part of what I will do from time to time is try to explain how it looks from different angles. And of course, some of the problems that we have that the United States has encountered as an external actor arise from not understanding the people that we're dealing with, imputing to them all kinds of generally very simple motives, and thinking therefore that their behavior can be changed but with rather simple tools, neither of which is the case. But let me go back and take again this stance of the international actor. Roughly speaking, well, first, if I can just situate this country we're talking about. So this is what I have these diagrams here for. This is a satellite view of the territory, which is now Afghanistan. If you look at this picture, you'll see that there are no borders on it, because there aren't any political borders in a satellite view. Those are things that developed over time through human history. And we do have a tendency to reify them. Here are the borders. It's not that they don't exist or that they're artificial. Of course they're artificial, but everything artificial is also part of nature, since human beings are part of nature. But these borders may have different meanings than what we impute to national borders. This basically shows, it's very mountainous. This must be a picture taken in summer, judging by where the snow is. There's quite a lot of areas that are not actually cultivated. The population is concentrated in a relatively few population centers, which cluster mostly around the presence of water and roads. Much of the country is not densely settled, which doesn't mean it's empty. It means it's used economically or socially in other ways. Roughly speaking, these are ethno-linguistic groups in Afghanistan and neighboring countries. Such maps are always extremely deceptive to the point that one almost doesn't want to present them, but because, of course, areas are mixed. Not only are areas mixed, but people are mixed, and they have different types of identities as well. But it does give you the idea that there are people with similar cultures and languages living on both sides of the border, which doesn't mean the borders are in the wrong place, as if there was a right place to put them. But it means that there are certain types of social ties, political ties, economic ties that are facilitated by those cultural or kinship links. And in particular, you'll notice the green in the lower right, which is the Pashtun population. It's somewhat, actually among them there are many differences, but there are actually more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. But in Afghanistan they're the largest group, and in Pakistan they're a minority, but there are more of them than there are in Afghanistan, which is very important in understanding the relations between the two countries. All right, that goes back to history. Now, let me go back to, so this is a country which, in these borders, is recognized as a member of the United Nations, has been recognized as such for quite some time. It was one of two Muslim countries that was a member of the League of Nations, and it was a founding member of the United Nations. I'll come back later to how it came into existence, but these borders were drawn by the British and the Russians at the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century in order to stabilize the competition between their empire. Of course, they didn't draw them completely arbitrarily. They had to engage in a number of wars first with various power holders on that territory. But Afghanistan, structured as it is now, was originally part of the defense structure of the British Empire, and it was structured to be part of the defense structure of the British Empire, not to be an independent country or to represent the people who live within those borders. And that still has effects today. Now, let me go back to international interest in Afghanistan. Well, one way that I noticed there are a number of famous economists in this school, including Nobel Prize winners and so on. One way that economists measure the value of various commodities or goods of sorts is through what they call revealed preferences, which is you analyze how much people are willing to pay for them. So using a rough version of the method of revealed preferences, we can say that the international community had an interest in Afghanistan of approximately $100 million a year right up to September 10th, 2001, because that's the amount of money that at least the UN asked for, did not always get, for mainly humanitarian operations in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was then, as it is now, one of the poorest countries in the world. It's so poor that we don't know how poor it is, although it seems to be more or less tied for last place with Somalia, Burundi, Sierra Leone, or a few other places. Economically, it is not similar to any other country outside of Africa. It actually has, according to statistics, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but at least according to statistics, it's about twice as poor as Haiti. In addition, it had then perhaps the weakest state in the world, except for Somalia, which actually has no state, except for Somaliland and the northern part of it, but the Somalia proper has no state. And you can measure that by the amount of revenue that the government extracts from the economy, by the reach of the bureaucracy, and many other things. That doesn't mean it has no governance or that it is anarchical. It means that the governance mechanisms predominantly occur outside of the formal entity that we call the state, and which is recognized by the international community. And this has a great deal to do with misperceptions on the part of internationals about how Afghanistan is governed. Now, since September 11th, of course, if we use revealed preferences again, the value of Afghanistan to the international community is now something on the order of $15 billion a year. So it went from $100 million to $15 billion if we count the cost of the military operations there as well. And certainly, if I could also use a cruder measure. The last time I gave a lecture about Afghanistan at Princeton University, which was about 15 years ago, I think there were 5 people who showed up. So the ratio is somewhat similar, as you see. Now, the reason for that is something which had very little to do with Afghanistan, namely that the United States was attacked by al-Qaeda, which at that time had its headquarters in Afghanistan. Now, I won't go through the history of how that happened. We can discuss that later. It's something that developed out of the confluence of developments in the Arab world primarily, and the way that those became intertwined with Afghanistan in the 1980s. The fact that Afghanistan did have such a weak government, which was very, in a way, not really a member of the international community of states, meant that this relatively small group, when it was expelled from Sudan, could then return to Afghanistan in 1996. But that meant we had there was an attack on the United States by a group that very few people in the government had been thinking about, based in a country that even fewer people in the government had been thinking about. And you had a phenomenon which I first noticed during the Clinton administration, which is that the importance of a decision in government is inversely proportionate to the amount of knowledge held by those who make the decision. In the sense that by the time, if a decision is really, really important, it gets kicked up to a level where no one actually knows about the situation that they're deciding about, because it's too important for specialists to be involved. And this is pretty much what happened with the decision-making after September 11th. That is, it was, even although the decision-making involved, of course, invading Afghanistan and putting a new government there, it was actually made on grounds that had nothing to do with Afghanistan. It was made on grounds of counterterrorism policy, which is to say, as President Bush said in his speech, that we would destroy those who attacked us and those who gave them refuge, meaning at that time the Taliban regime, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And basically, from everything that I've been able to find about the deliberations in the U.S. government at that time, all the discussion was about how to organize a combined military intelligence operation to destroy the al-Qaeda infrastructure in Afghanistan and destroy the Taliban regime. And actually, it was only about 2 weeks after those deliberations started that somebody in the State Department started thinking about what to do with the country of Afghanistan afterwards. Similarly, the approaches to the neighbors, the original instructions to diplomats were entirely get us bases and rights to use airspace so that we can carry out the military operations. And it's only later that some political issues started to be discussed, and some of them actually still have hardly been discussed to this day. And the Obama administration is trying to do that now, a bit belatedly. Not that I can blame them, of course. So what happened was, first, the U.S. had a policy of basically arming whomever it could arm in Afghanistan and funding whoever it could fund in Afghanistan in order to fight against those who had attacked the United States and those who had harbored them. Now, in doing so, that meant the U.S. government became involved in a very complex. I mean, I'm sure that Princeton town politics is also quite complex. Complex is what we call things we don't understand. But it's a political struggle among various ethnic groups in Afghanistan involving ideologies, histories, and so on. I'll go into that a little bit later, although not too much except in the question period. But that was quite incidental to what they were trying to accomplish. So from the point of view of many Afghans, we ended up arming people that had been expelled from the country by the Taliban, which for many people was the only thing the Taliban did that they approved of, and brought them back to power, changed actually the balance of power among different groups in the country, and very much, even through just the way that our organizations operated, had a huge effect on the economy in ways that had nothing to do with our policy. For instance, if I just may mention that if you look at IMF data, the exchange rate of the Afghan currency, against the dollar doubled in 2 months in the fall of 2001. That is, the Afghani, you get twice as many dollars per Afghani in 2 to 3 months, in December 2001 as in September 2001, simply because of the huge amounts of US dollars cash that the CIA put into this extremely poor country. Now, when you do that, obviously that changes prices of goods on the market. People have to look where to invest, what to do with all this new cash that they have, and of course a lot of them put it into financing the next year's opium crop, which is one of the few profitable investments that they had. But this was an effect of our policy, but not intended or even very much understood. Now, so this was a military policy. At the same time, there was another channel in the State Department which led the government to call on the UN to put together some kind of political settlement and a program for reconstruction. The Bush administration did not consider that a core goal. They didn't want to get tied down doing that in Afghanistan. They had bigger plans. But they recognized they had to do something, and that is why they asked the United Nations to do it. Because from their point of view, you ask the United Nations to do something that you don't consider to be of primary importance. And that led to the convening of the Bonn talks on Afghanistan, which led to the Bonn Agreement and the birth of the government of Hamid Karzai. I just want to say a few words about that because some of the structures that came out of that are still with us today. And also it's something I happen to know something about firsthand because I was there. The Bonn Agreement was drafted and negotiated by, on the one hand, by a UN team that had a certain vision of what they wanted to accomplish, and by a quite unrepresentative group of Afghans who, were people who we could convene. Basically, it consisted of the group that represented most of the commanders on the ground, mostly from northern Afghanistan, and therefore largely from non-Pashtun ethnic groups, as you can see on this map, and the group led by the exiled former king, who had been living in Rome since in 1973, which meant you had a combination of a certain type of power on the ground and a certain type of historical legitimacy. On the other hand, the power on the ground was limited by the regions where those groups had originally been active, which was largely in northern, western, and central Afghanistan, and the legitimacy of the ex-king was also quite limited in the sense that his dynasty came to power in part through a civil war and an ethnic conflict, and his legitimacy was not as uncontested throughout the country as his supporters liked to say it was. So to some extent, the international model for how to restore legitimate authority in Afghanistan was flawed. Not that there was necessarily a much better model that would within the same time frame. I should also, the time frame is important to bear in mind because there are a lot of criticisms which are valid in the way that the Bonn Agreement just resurrected the old dysfunctional state structure of Afghanistan. It didn't introduce any much needed reforms and so on. All of that is completely true and is the inevitable result if you pull together a bunch of unrepresentative people and give them 8 days to form a new government in a country that's been at war for 20 years. Essentially, it's, in Burundi they had a peace process. It took 4 years with working groups on all of these topics. But this was really an emergency response. And part of the reason that we see it failing today and collapsing in ways that are reminiscent of what happened over the past several decades is because the same causes produce the same effects, and the fundamental causes of those conflicts have not really been addressed. But it set up a nominally democratic state structure, which it wasn't democratic to begin with, but a set of grand councils, which is an Afghan institution that is nominally based on tribal tradition, so in fact it's a state institution, leading to national elections. There was a tension in the Bonn Agreement between the reality of the U.S. military policy and the aspirations of the UN team and some of the Afghans there to actually build institutions and stabilize Afghanistan. And those two missions, what we might loosely call the counterterrorism mission and the stabilization mission, were at odds in the agreement and have been at odds in many ways since that time. The Bonn Agreement has in it only a very few specific, what they call benchmarks, times when you have to accomplish something, like setting up the government, a new constitution, and having elections. It has a lot of aspirational statements about building state institutions. That is, it talks about reorganizing all the armed groups in the country into security forces. It talks about reforming the civil service, reforming the judiciary, instituting a new currency to overcome the war-driven hyperinflation, which actually they succeeded in doing, a human rights commission, reform of appointments in the administration. And it has an annex calling for an international security assistance force to help make the government independent from armed commanders and prevent a new civil war. And it has another annex calling for massive economic assistance to reconstruct the country. However, all of those things were aspirational rather than required, and also it was an agreement that only had Afghan parties to it, so it didn't impose any obligations on the international actors who would have been able to supply the resources for that. And in various ways, through the next 4 or 5 years, those two agendas continue to be at odds, and I'm sure that you have your own personal stories about that from your time as ambassador. By the way, I also witnessed his swearing in as ambassador at the embassy in Kabul in March 2002, which was an exceptional event because normally you're sworn in Washington, aren't you?
A gritty ceremony.
A gritty ceremony. At that time, they were still sleeping on cots in the old embassy building before they turned it into a Miami-style condo development, as it is now, but without the ocean. Maybe I should say Arizona, actually. And for instance, the basic idea of the International Security Assistance Force was to demilitarize the capital city of Kabul and then expand to other regional centers, so that a civilian-led government could emerge without being dominated by armed groups. Because this is one of the things that is a bit difficult to understand when you've grown up in a country that has a government and that always has had a government, which is when a government collapses, when there's no army or police. Sorry.
Would you please turn off your cell phones?
No, please turn off your cell phones. There we go. Okay. That's Leonard Cohen singing Hallelujah, by the way. That's my ringtone. In a government, well, that's an interesting diagram. I'll just leave it there. In a government, in this country where there is no army, no administration, basically the only way that a group of people can exercise power or influence is by organizing themselves into an armed group. And gaining control of assets. So politics basically took the form of a struggle among armed groups. In the 1990s, when there was a coalition government of Mujahideen in Afghanistan, they never did manage to reconstitute an army that was not connected to a faction. And the result was politics consisted of struggle among various armed groups and their political extensions when they existed. The Bonn Agreement was designed to prevent that by getting the armed groups out of the cities and having an international force to maintain order until Afghan security forces were created. But Donald Rumsfeld vetoed the demilitarization of the cities and the expansion of the International Security Assistance Force because he didn't want it conflicting with the U.S. Warfighting operations. And there are many other cases like this as well. The United States initially, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the first year did not allocate any new money for reconstruction or assistance, but just reprogrammed existing humanitarian assistance, and didn't start a road building program until President Karzai actually came to Washington almost a year after September 11th and personally asked President Bush for it. Is this an accurate?
Mostly true.
Mostly true. Okay. Well, you can. And other respects. And there was however, as time went by, I would say actually within the U.S. government, the more maximalist comprehensive program tended to win out, largely, as far as I can see, because the military commanders in the field, not that they were the only ones saying this, but they were the only ones saying this who were actually listened to, were saying that they could not accomplish a lot of what they needed to accomplish unless they had something to offer the people. And various other events occurred along the way. They realized that you couldn't hold a credible-looking election if most of the territory is controlled by armed groups rather than the government, which led to the removal of some regional warlords and so on in 2004, and culminated eventually in the document which supposedly regulates relations between Afghanistan and the international community today, which is the Afghanistan Compact, which was approved in London in January, end of January, early February 2006, and which is has a comprehensive program for building a state in Afghanistan. At least it has a comprehensive list of projects that could become a program for building a state in Afghanistan. Building state institutions, security institutions, developing the economy, reforming governance, and so on. And is supposed to be a compact between Afghanistan and the major actors of the international community. Now, what actually happened is that in 2006 there was a major spike in insurgent activity, which has accelerated since that time. I wouldn't say, people often talk about the government having control or not control of various parts of Afghanistan, which is a very deceptive concept. Again, because as I mentioned, most governance in Afghanistan has not been carried out by formal state institutions. So the concept of government control is not a very adequate one for expressing how the country is organized. But the amount of territory and population to which the government doesn't have access or has access only at parts of the time and so on has certainly increased, and its relations with its neighbors, and in particular Pakistan, deteriorated to the point where it became very difficult, if not impossible, to implement many of the elements in the Afghanistan Compact. So what it turned out, there was a struggle between a kind of a minimalist counterterrorism agenda, which was defined by the administration as capture and kill, and a more maximalist agenda of state building, political development, and so on. But what it turned out is that the basic political conditions for either of those agendas to succeed had not been realized. And in fact, the international policy, and primarily U.S. policy, had just kind of skipped over or ignored those long-standing political problems which have now come back to haunt us. Now, today you will read in the media about the current administration discussing whether to reduce objectives in Afghanistan and Pakistan, or whether to become more modest in them. I think that's actually a misreading of the situation. I think what has happened is that reality has finally made itself known, and the result is that what the new administration faces is the need to define objectives that can be achieved with resources that actually can exist. And more or less the situation we were in, and this is not just my opinion, this is the opinion of several internal reviews that were carried out at the end of the Bush administration, is that the U.S. and the international community enunciated extremely grandiose goals in Afghanistan, transformational goals, and then allocated extremely minimal resources to it. So there's a huge gap between the enunciated goals and the resources allocated to it. What we're now going through a process of doing is try to align goals with resources so that we can actually maybe we'll say we'll do less, but we'll accomplish more because we'll be able to actually accomplish it. Now let me go back briefly and sketch out what that is. Basically, the fundamental main security goal of the United States and most of the international community, the reason for the jump from 100 million to 15 billion a year is because there was a safe haven for the leadership of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Now there's a safe haven for al-Qaeda in the federally administered tribal agencies of Pakistan. And actually there is no long-term al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. There are no bases there or anything like that, just some individuals operating cross-border from Pakistan from time to time. Now, so the basic core security mission, really the only reason for which we're fighting a war, although not the only reason to be involved, because the United States and UN and other organizations are involved all over the world in places where we are not fighting wars. So unfortunately, the militarization of our foreign policy sometimes leads us to think that being involved in fighting a war is the same thing, which it isn't. But the only reason for fighting a war there, actually, is because we were attacked from there. And the purpose of the war is to assure that we won't get attacked from there again, which is much more complicated than that sentence. But basically, it means at least working with Afghans and also with Pakistanis, and I'll come back to that, and others in the region, to enable them to set up institutions of government or governance that will be partners of the international community and will at least have the capacity to police their territories in their own interest and international interest. And then all these other processes, transformational processes, restructuring the state, development, and so on, they can go on. But of course, those things, they take a long time. It takes maybe 9 to 12 months to organize a major terrorist attack, but it takes much longer to build a state, even under the best of circumstances, and it's much less predictable. So you can't really say that your answer to the terrorist threat is to take one of the poorest countries in the world and turn it into a prosperous, gender-sensitive democracy in 2 years. Because if you try to do it in 2 years, you won't succeed, and you will create a lot of unforeseen unintended consequences. So that's, in a way, it's going back to the initial counterterrorism objective, but realizing that it's not primarily a kill and capture mission, because that has to do with the misdiagnosis of al-Qaeda carried out by the Bush administration, which is that it's a bunch of extremists who hate us, so let's kill and capture them. Whereas actually al-Qaeda is more like a global insurgency having to do with political problems, mostly political problems not in this region but in the Middle East, but that has then became involved in Afghanistan-Pakistan region in the 1980s and in a way took advantage of the political problems between Afghanistan and Pakistan, particularly in the Pashtun areas, to construct a kind of base for itself. So the political approach to the problem of the safe haven is to try to work on those governance problems in a more sustainable way, which mainly through political means as well as military means, rather than to set up institutions, which means that fundamentally the counterterrorism problem politically is to separate the local allies of al-Qaeda, let's say the local hosts of al-Qaeda, from al-Qaeda, because they don't have the same agenda necessarily. They may have certain shared agendas. And in a way, the doctrine of the war on terror that said those who harbor al-Qaeda will suffer the same fate pushed all of a lot of people with different kinds of agendas into the same category as far as our policy was concerned. So they're detained together at Guantanamo, they're held under the same sanctions and so on. So one of the very difficult political tasks that we will now face will be to have a more differentiated policy between various types of insurgents in Afghanistan and Pakistan and al-Qaeda. Now, we go back to history a little bit and what these diagrams are about. What was the conditions? Afghanistan was relatively stable for about a century. Relatively stable in the sense that it wasn't from like 1879 to 1978. Of course, it had plenty of upheavals, problems, and so on, but it didn't become the focus of an international conflict of any sort. Now, how did that happen? Essentially, in the end of the 19th century, the British and the Russians reached an agreement that Afghanistan would be kept isolated. It would be under, roughly speaking, British suzerainty. That is, the British funded the government, gave weapons and arms to the ruler. The country, basically had very few foreigners in it, and Britain and Russia, who were the two powers on the ground, military powers on the ground there, agreed to certain rules of the game. They also agreed to, let's see, here we go. This is the Anglo-Russian Convention. They agreed to spheres of influence in Iran, including the one in the middle, the neutral sphere, which separated the British from the Russian sphere of influence. Afghanistan was in the British sphere of influence, but was not directly ruled by the British. It didn't have a British military presence. So basically, there was an agreement among the great powers not to fight each other in Afghanistan at the cost of making Afghanistan isolated. Now, why was this possible? First of all, it was possible because the population of Afghanistan was living in these, of course, this is not from the 19th century, this is today, but was quite isolated. It was living largely in valleys where there was some water, in a few population centers. There were very few roads. It doesn't mean that they were not culturally or civilizationally isolated. That is, these were not like people living in the jungle somewhere in the Philippines who were back in the Stone Age. They went on pilgrimage to Mecca. They were involved in all the intellectual currents of the Islamic world and beyond. They were involved in international trade. But all those things took a very long time. And the number of people who were involved in them was relatively small because travel took such a long time and so on. So it was integrated, but it was integrated at a very low speed, which meant that it didn't affect the daily lives of people to the same extent. And there was an agreement between basically two powers. Finally, the government that was set up was, we call it a government, we call it a state, which actually sometimes using that same word, is an obstacle to understanding because we think it has functions similar to what we think of as our government. First thing we think of our government doing is it represents us, and it protects our rights and provides us with services. That is not what a government in this part of the world did. A government or a state was an apparatus of power through which an individual or a group controlled territory or population. And representation had nothing to do with it. Now, that control could be more or less legitimate depending on whether the ruler or the ruling group acted justly. That is, so setting up courts to enforce Islamic law or other forms of justice was extremely important. Keeping the roads safe was extremely important. Building schools, protecting people's rights, and all that was not particularly important. Those were things communities could do them for themselves if they wanted to, and maybe the government would even help them. And if the government managed to prevent a lot of murderers from running around and wars from taking place, then of course that would make it easier to do that. But basically this was a very centralized administrative apparatus, the purpose of which was basically to maintain we might say negative control of the territory, that is, to prevent opposition, to prevent foreign opponents from entering the area, to prevent various groups from trying to overthrow the state, and not to provide positive services. Now, and this is actually the origin of one of the key problems that people talk about today but don't always understand the reason for, which is if you have a country which has people with a lot of different ethnic groups, cultural differences, even if they have religious commonalities, living in highly separated areas with little communication, suppose you wanted to set up a government to provide accountable services to those people, you would set up a decentralized government in which the people in each valley and so on would be supported in some way in their efforts to provide services to each other. However, the government of Afghanistan, the state structure of Afghanistan, is extremely centralized. That is it is now, and it has been since the late 19th century, that is the chief executive, whether he is a president, a king, or an emir, appoints all the governors. They appoint the district governors. Below that, there are not even any provincial budgets. There's one national budget, and each ministry is like a little silo that, without any real coordinating mechanism in the provinces. And why is that? So very often foreigners, and that includes myself initially, come there and think the reason for that is there's some intellectual error that people there have made, and they haven't understood that they actually need a decentralized government. But that's not the reason. The reason is that the purpose of the government is not that. The purpose of the government is to control the territory in the interest of the ruling group and then to legitimate itself through some justice functions. Now, I should add, the nature of that ruling group is also very important. I haven't talked about ethnicity and tribalism, which are very important issues, and I won't be able to talk about them in much depth now. But today's this territory has been the location, not exactly in these borders, but roughly speaking, this territory, Kabul, Bal, Herat, and so on, has been the site of states for a long time of various sorts under different loose territorial names like Khurasan and so on. It became a state with the name Afghanistan, well, or at least it became a state of Afghans, ruled by Afghans, meaning at that time Pashtuns, only in the 18th century. And this particular state structure is one in which the state, and remember I said a state is an apparatus controlled by an individual or group, has been certain tribes or sub-tribes of Pashtuns. And part of the way that the state organized itself was as a redistributive apparatus to give land to Pashtun supporters. Actually, it was to co-opt Pashtun opponents by giving them land that belonged to non-Pashtuns, settling them in different parts of the country. So there was a kind of ethno-tribal stratification of power as well, which was reinforced by the subsidy that was given to the central government by the British, and then later jointly by the United States and the Soviet Union during the period of the Cold War, because it gave that central group, which was basically a particular lineage of the Mohammedzai clan of the Barakzai tribe of Durrani Pashtuns, the resources to co-opt, build an army, and dominate others. So that there has always been a kind of ethnic contestation of the state among those groups involved in national politics, which was a relatively limited group. At local levels, you had other kinds of competition, of course. Now, all this broke down gradually in the course of the 20th century, leading to a situation in the 1980s and so on, in that, first of all, instead of Russia, instead of Russia and Britain, you had the Soviet Union, then India and Pakistan, then you had India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, then you didn't have the Soviet Union, you had the post-Soviet Union, you had the United States instead of Britain. So Iran became independent, had an Islamic revolution. So now you have a much larger group of international actors. There's no way to reach an agreement between a British Empire and a Russian Empire. You have Pakistani interests, Iranian interests, U.S., and so on. The eastern border of Afghanistan became even more contentious because of Pakistan becoming independent and being in a conflict with India. Afghanistan has never recognized that border as an international border. It's called the Durand Line. Hasn't recognized the incorporation of Pashtun areas of Pakistan into Pakistan. And Pakistan now has a very different security problem than did or would an undivided India, because an undivided India was the regional hegemon, clearly. Pakistan has a much bigger enemy on the other side, India, and is concerned about India getting a foothold to its west in Afghanistan. Therefore, Pakistan has been actually much more active in trying to incorporate Afghanistan into its sphere of influence, especially since it lost its eastern half, Bangladesh, in the early 1970s, and has actually used various Islamist groups, including today the Taliban, to undermine Afghan nationalism and as a method of projecting power across the border, primarily in order to prevent India, along with Iran and Russia, from gaining a foothold there. So it's because the international problem has become much more complex. Plus, today you have also U.S.-Iran conflict is inside Afghanistan. You have, because NATO is there, conflict between Russia and NATO is inside Afghanistan. because Russia would like Taliban and al-Qaeda to be defeated, but they wouldn't like NATO to have a permanent presence close to their southern border and so on. So there's a much larger set of international issues that would have to be, I won't even say resolved, addressed before you got the same kind of consensus, international consensus on Afghanistan. In terms of the society is no longer that isolated society. Now, if you fly over Afghanistan, you're still seeing people living in those valleys. What you don't see is their relatives in Dubai, and how many of them have relatives that are living in Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, Pakistan, Iran, Dubai. You don't see their radios, because one thing that Afghans do is listen to international radio all the time. I mean, I have a driver in Kabul, because he's from the government, because I was doing some consulting for the government. So this guy has a third-grade education, and he's barely literate. But all he does all day, as far as I can tell, besides drive me around, is listen to international news in 4 different languages. Now, I don't know how many graduate students there are in the United States that spend all day listening to international news in 4 different languages, but that's what my semi-literate driver does. And he's quite well informed because he knows that international politics affects his daily life, and it has affected his daily life. He's lived in Afghanistan, he's lived in Pakistan, and he's lived in Dubai. So he's well-traveled, too. Probably more Afghans have traveled abroad than Americans, proportionately speaking, even if they have often done so without passports. The economy has also been transformed. People talk about the drug industry primarily here as a criminal enterprise or as a drug problem, but what it means is, for the first time in history of this territory, the largest industry is the production of a commercial crop for the international market. Okay. Now, it so happens that Afghanistan's main comparative advantage is the production of illegality and insecurity. Therefore, it produces an illegal crop. But nonetheless, it means that even in small villages, people are linked to an international market. They're affected by price effects, currency effects, and they have, and their political organizations are also linked into the international market. Their political organizations, are basically organizations that mediate between the power holders in this economy, including the people in the drug economy, and various foreign powers, intelligence agencies, and so on. So they carry out it's actually, being an Afghan political leader is much more complicated, it seems to me, in many respects, than being an American political leader, because every Afghan political leader has to be a diplomat dealing with 10 different countries because of the way that the international community is involved. Now, what it means is the problem of legitimating the government in Afghanistan is much more difficult, because now people are demanding services, these kind of communal arrangements and subsistence economy has broken down, and yet the state structure and the resource base to provide people with what they're now demanding, education, healthcare, opportunities, employment, and so on, is not there. And the political conflict within the region and the world is actually preventing the stabilization of that state structure, so that it could gradually reform itself and try to meet some of those demands. Now, the way this affects us is, of course, there are a lot of areas of the world that have problems. The Democratic Republic of Congo probably has worse problems than Afghanistan from the point of view of the people who live there. I'll wind up soon. But we haven't been attacked from there. So the problem we have now is to recognize the complexity and difficulty of these issues, but actually start to deal with the very basic ones, so that we can get a minimum of stability that gives us a little time to work with Afghans, Pakistanis, and people in the region to deal with these longer-term issues. And for that, I think, and now this is what the policy review is about, key issues are how Pakistan defines its national interest and its national security, whether it's possible to separate elements of the insurgency from al-Qaeda, which is fundamentally the reason we're there. I mean, there's a lot of confusion. Very often people talk about the reason we're fighting in Afghanistan is because we hate the Taliban, because of their reactionary policies and so on. But of course, they had those reactionary policies on September 10th, 2001, and we were not engaged in a war against them. And there are a lot of governments, that we don't like the Burmese junta either, but we haven't invaded Burma. So war is reserved for certain very major goals. But it's become increasingly difficult to disentangle ourselves from all of these issues in which we have become involved, in which our government actually has not understood very well. But that is the reason that the administration has appointed a high-level diplomatic envoy, Richard Holbrooke, given him a regional mandate, and is now engaged in this policy review to try to match this problem, which is much more complex than was understood, with the resources that we have, which of course currently are also diminishing thanks to the economic crisis.
Thanks. Okay, we have ample time, I think, for questions and answers. If you'd like, maybe you could come down to the mics. It would be easier than scratching around. Sir.
Dr. Rubin, thank you for coming here. Very short question. Karzai has been talking about Russia. There's rumors in the news that Karzai has been talking to Russia. This is a great game question, as you can tell. Russia has, well, it's thought in some circles that Russia will try to undermine U.S. interests either in the Middle East, Central Asia, elsewhere abroad in Europe. How strong is Russia's incentive, if it has any incentive, to undermine our interests in the region or in Afghanistan? How could they, and should we even care?
Okay, let me take a couple questions, and then we'll see if a thread emerges or not. Yes.
My question concerns the Iranian position in Afghanistan. What sort of credence do you give to the idea that Iran is playing a part in supporting the resurgent Taliban in Afghanistan, given the historical animosity, ideological differences between them, and the initial support that Iran gave to the international community ousting them?
Yes.
Is it sensible to try to rebuild Afghanistan? Wouldn't we be better off to spend $1 billion a year to pay the leadership the way it was done 100 years ago? Is this a fool's errand?
All right, let me take these two. The first two are related questions. I'm trying to think how to make a more general statement, but let me just answer the questions. First of all, one of the problems that we have faced in the United States, in designing policy in Afghanistan is, if we look at it objectively, what happened in 2001 is not even that the United States started an operation or put together a coalition. The United States joined an existing coalition. That was a coalition of Russia, Iran, India, and the Northern Alliance to fight against the Taliban, who were supported by Pakistan. And the United States joined with Russia, Iran, and India, basically, and became the biggest member of that partnership in supporting the Northern Alliance. Now, because of our long-standing close military relationship with Pakistan and our antagonism to Iran over other issues, not over this, and I would say lower level of strategic competition with Russia, we nonetheless made Pakistan, whose interests were basically opposed to us, into our main partner without taking that into account. That is, the Bush administration seemed to deceive itself into thinking that it had changed Pakistan's basic political and strategic orientation in the region and made it an ally in this, which it had not done. Which isn't because the government of Pakistan, wants to destroy America and support Al Qaeda. It's because they have a perspective which is based on their notion of the national security of Pakistan and its relationship to the various social and political forces in the region. With respect to Iran, I personally witnessed Iran being diplomatically extremely helpful to the UN and others during the Bonn talks in helping to broker the agreement. I understand that on the ground, Iran, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, collaborated with the U.S. Special Forces and the CIA in supplying and so on the Northern Alliance. And then in his State of the Union message a few months later, President Bush put Iran on the axis of evil, this was Iran of President Khatami, by the way, not the Iran of President Ahmadinejad, which caused a reaction in Iran, which is, well, the Americans aren't interested in cooperating with us, whatever we do anyway, which has something to do with, we can exaggerate the effect, but it certainly had something to do with political developments in Iran subsequently. Now, there's supposedly this intelligence information that according to what I've been told, and I can talk about it because I don't have a security clearance and I'm not authorized to have any of this information anyway. But supposedly, according to what I've been told, the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is supplying small amounts of weapons to certain insurgent groups, primarily in western Afghanistan. Now, in fact, this has nothing to do with Iran's Afghanistan policy. It has everything to do with Iran's America policy, or with America's Iran policy. That is, Iran saw that there were very influential forces in the previous administration who wanted to attack Iran and change its regime. And not only saw that, it saw that the United States actually did that, first in Afghanistan on Iran's eastern border, and then in Iraq on Iran's western border. So we can't really say that they're totally paranoid fantasists who imagine this. Eventually they reached the point where their policy, and initially their point of view in Afghanistan was, however the United States treats us, stability in Afghanistan and supporting this government is our number one priority. In 2007, it changed during Ahmadinejad's presidency, and as a result of some events here, and they decided that it was more important to prepare their response for any American attack. This is as the nuclear issue became more important. And that was the context in which they started giving some small amount of aid to certain insurgent elements in Afghanistan, basically to send a message that we can respond. And this is just a small sample of what we can do. It had absolutely nothing to do with Iran's plans for Afghanistan, except in the sense that everybody is thinking, what if the government collapses, the United States withdraws? Well, Iran didn't want Pakistan to have a monopoly on relations with the Taliban, who would then become more important. But that was not the main thinking. Again, this has to do with a more general problem, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is that the perceptions of people in the region of what we are trying to do are very often divergent from what we think we are trying to do. That is, and sometimes they are more accurate about us than our own perceptions of ourselves, also, I might add. So one can learn from so-called conspiracy theories. But certainly in Washington, when I talk to officials of a certain type, I have a great deal of difficulty convincing them that people in the region believe that the United States has a lot of malevolent conspiratorial intentions in the region, because as far as they're concerned, no one could possibly believe something that ridiculous. So I'm not even asking them to believe it. I'm just asking them to believe that other people believe it. But even that is difficult. And that is actually one of the obstacles to our making good policy, because we give off signals that we don't understand ourselves, which are interpreted in ways that lead to reactions that then we also misinterpret. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, Russia is very ambivalent, but to some extent they now got us where they want us, in the sense that, first of all, there was a school of thought in the United States in the 1980s, which was that, Afghanistan was payback for Vietnam. They sent weapons to kill us, so now we're sending weapons to kill them. So the Russians cannot help themselves from a certain schadenfreude in seeing that after all of our self-righteous language about what they did, we're doing a lot of the same things and actually less successfully. And even though we have more resources. But more, I don't think that dominates their policy. That's just a little gut reaction they have. Basically, they think that Taliban and Al-Qaeda is a big threat to them, potentially. Taliban recognized Chechnya. Obviously, Taliban, we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of Taliban, but Russians often do. But Putin in particular, I'm told, considers what he would call Islamic fundamentalism or radicalism a big threat, maybe the major long-term threat to Russia and the area of the former Soviet Union. And even though, if you look at it organizationally now, it's not a big threat, he considers it potentially a very important threat. And actually, that they don't want to go back to Afghanistan again. They consider that the United States, by fighting Taliban and Al-Qaeda, is fighting their fight, and they would like to support it. On the other hand, the United States, in order to carry this out, established NATO bases in Central Asia and got NATO involved in Afghanistan. And what Russia sees as another major threat to their security and their interest is their encirclement by NATO. So what they would like us to succeed and then leave. And what's happening now is that because of the insecurity of our supply lines in Pakistan, we're becoming more dependent on supply lines through Russia and the Soviet Union, which means that while they will be in a position to help us be more successful, they will also be in a position to squeeze us later in order to try to assure that we don't turn this into a permanent presence, which very much suits their interest. However, I don't think we shouldn't exaggerate, this level of Russian antagonism and turn into a new Cold War. The fact that Karzai is talking to Russia is nothing new. What's the only thing that's new is that it got reported in the newspapers. I mean, the government of Afghanistan has good relations with Russia, which is not a bordering state, but certainly a relatively close neighboring state. And to some extent, every new invader and every new government wipes out the sins of the previous invader and the previous bad government by committing new ones of its own, so that I would say Russia no longer carries the full weight of negative feeling that was borne by the Soviet Union from the 1980s now, when they see that maybe some other world powers are not that much better. I didn't answer the third question now. Okay, now, is it sensible to... The problem is, it might be sensible from a pure realpolitik point of view to just pay the ruler to control Afghanistan, if you could do that, but you can't, for the reasons that I mentioned before. It's not the same country. It's now a very mobilized country with a huge cash economy, a large diaspora, highly militarized politics, and so on. And it can't be contained by the same type of small, lightly subsidized state. Now, that is why the strategic objective of the Afghan government in terms of the region is no longer to isolate the country from the region, to stabilize it, which is what Amir Abdurrahman Khan did in the 19th century, but to make it what they call a land bridge or a connector state, which will link the various regions around it to each other and also to the Persian Gulf. However, politically, that is much more demanding because it means that the various neighboring states have to feel that by investing in Afghanistan and strengthening something from which other neighbors will also benefit, they will not be subsidizing their enemies. And at this point, they're not convinced of that. Follow-up, yes.
Could you talk a little bit about physical challenges of turning Afghanistan into a land bridge, for instance? There are 3 different railroad gauges in the surrounding countries, and there are very few roads.
Before you answer that, why don't you connect?
I'm not going to get into the railroad gauges, although I do have a very deep knowledge of the subject.
Gave us a ground sweep tour d'horizon, but I wanted to pressure you a little bit on 3 key issues, which I'm sure you spent some time working about. Number 1, the opium and the drugs. You haven't said much, if at all, what advisable U.S. politics, and especially what will be the issue about that in the strategic review coming up. Number 2, the elections. What is the United States going to do, not only with the current incumbent and holder of the presidency, because if we remember the visit of then Senator Biden, the meeting between him and President Karzai was anything but amicable. It actually ended in a walkout of Senator Biden. And what will the United States do with regard to the potential candidates? All of them we know well. Ashraf Ghani is one of them. Dr. Abdullah may be another one of them. Former Minister Jalari may be the third one. He stood here a couple of 2 years ago now. Is the new administration trying to shape the outcome in a way which will remove its policies? Or are we going the extra step and let the Afghans in a relatively free election, decide about their own fate. And that leads me to the last issue, namely the perception of the Afghans. How do they perceive us?
Okay, well, on opium, I've written a lot about this issue. However, my basic view is that the reason, there's an international demand for illegal drugs, and it's an international market. The production of the raw material migrates to the place with the right natural endowments where the cost of producing illegality is the least. So it has migrated to Afghanistan. The economic benefits of opium to rural communities are much overstated, certainly, especially compared to what they could do if there wasn't a war going on, and it was actually possible to market illicit crops, which is now extremely difficult. So I think basically the way you decrease the importance of opium and heroin and drug trafficking in the Afghan economy is through ending the war, increasing security, and building up institutions that make it possible for people to do other economic activities. I could give you a list of very specific policies to address it as well, but basically I think it's a result and not a cause. And if you try to attack this particular result and make that into a core element of your policy, you will create a reaction that will be counterproductive. In particular, you cannot replace 1/3 of the economy of one of the poorest countries in the world and with one of the weakest states in the world through law enforcement. Just basic statistic, the domestic revenue of the Afghan government, which has gone up tremendously, by the way, since 2001, is now equal to about 25% of the gross profits of the opium industry. So it's a very unequal contest. You can't say the government should, destroy something that's 4 times larger than the government. For the elections, obviously this is a very sensitive issue, but rather than answer your specific questions about what the administration may be thinking, which either I don't know or if I did know I couldn't tell you, the basic difficulty with the elections in Afghanistan is similar to the paradox I mentioned earlier, which is that the society has changed, people are mobilized, but the institutions have not at all caught up with the way that the society has changed as a result of war, migration, drug economy, and so on. I would say with elections, there are 2 things. One is the institutions in Afghanistan are not such that you can determine who is in power by counting votes. But the society is such is that you cannot rule Afghanistan if you haven't been elected. So you have to have elections, but the elections by themselves are not enough to ensure that you can actually exercise power. The last elections went pretty well because at that time there was a clear hegemon, the United States, and there was a clear candidate that people knew had international support. Now, it's not just a question of elections. There's a full-scale constitutional crisis in Afghanistan about the scheduling of elections, whether Hamid Karzai will be the president at all after May 22nd, when the Constitution says his term is over, yet they cannot practically hold elections before that, and many other issues. So actually, there is a major crisis of legitimacy coming up, which is much bigger than the question of Karzai or not Karzai, Jalalia. And there are a lot of other moving parts. That is, an important part of the opposition will only support any plan for getting over this crisis if it includes changing the form of government from a presidential system to a semi-presidential or parliamentary system, which is not something actually that you can do in a few months, because you don't just change one article in a constitution. It involves a whole range of other things in the system, and they do not seem to have fully absorbed that idea. On the other hand, so there is a very serious problem, more than I think the usual one that we read about in the press of Karzai or not Karzai. And especially in a unitary centralized system like that, the legitimacy of the president is really the keystone of the system. I have a kind of diffuse feeling that Afghan political elites are very skilled at brinkmanship. They have, at this point, most of the ones who have the experience of the last 30 years have not died yet. And therefore, ultimately, they're really allergic to doing something that will push the country back into the abyss. But they might miscalculate. But in my experience of seeing them go in crises in the past few years is that they go right to the brink and then they make some deal, especially if they have international assistance in doing it. So I'm hopeful they might do that, but certainly when we factor in, again, that this is likely to be the most military active summer with the most insurgency, and we factor into the fact that Pakistan might go through economic collapse in the next few months as it is running out of foreign exchange reserves and does not have an adequate rescue package, it's quite unpredictable. The Afghan perception of foreigners in general. Well, there's some survey data, but I don't really believe in the levels of answers to the questions in the survey data, but I do believe in the trends that it tracks over time. And what the trends show is a very rapid collapse in support for the international presence in Afghanistan. And basically, one reason is, and this is a long-standing misunderstanding, ever since 1947, Afghan governments have wanted a direct alliance with the United States. And the reason they wanted a direct alliance with the United States is to do the one thing that the United States is not willing to do, and that is stand up to Pakistan. Okay? So basically, in 2001, they thought, finally the United States is here, they're fighting the Taliban, they're going to stand up to Pakistan. And we didn't. And it even turns out maybe we can't control Pakistan, which, of course, people in the region believe Pakistan is our puppet government. And actually, they think, you asked a question about is Iran supporting the Taliban. I think a more widespread belief than that Iran is supporting the Taliban is that the United States is supporting the Taliban. That's an extremely widespread belief. And the reason for that is that the United States is a superpower. And Pakistan is a puppet of the United States. And the Taliban are a creature of Pakistan. So how could a bunch of ignorant mullahs supported by a puppet of the United States got in this position if they weren't actually being supported by the United States? And the reason they're being supported by the United States is so that it will have an excuse for stationing its troops in Afghanistan in order to get at the wealth of Central Asia or attack Iran or something like this. But this is a very widespread belief, which may seem strange to you, but it is actually not any stranger than believing that Saddam Hussein supported al-Qaeda, which is something that people have believed in this country. So bear in mind that odd conspiracy theories are not, not only their problem. But basically, I think what they've discovered is actually we're not any smarter than they are. I mean, they should have known before, and we should have known before. But we don't actually have the answer to their problems, And they really they thought, the United States will come here, they'll put in good government, develop the economy, stop Pakistan. We didn't do any of those things. And actually, we're not capable of doing any of those things. We are capable of doing a better job than we have. That is certainly true. And therefore, I would say there's a healthy aspect to this disenchantment. The problem is whether we can then move on to a more realistic partnership or not, or whether people are just so alienated. I would add the issue of the civilian casualties is extremely important, and the number of them, the number of civilian casualties is less important than the political, and some of the arguments about whether a certain incident happened one way or the other, I mean, obviously that has some relevance, but the important thing is what Afghans said basically is if they're here to help us, then we will support them and not consider them as invaders. If they're here to pursue some agenda at our expense, then we will consider them as invaders. And actually, they were desperate enough after these 20, now 30 years of war, that they don't actually see the alternative very clearly to being helped by this incompetent and ineffective international community. They still don't quite see what the alternative is, even though they're becoming disenchanted. And what you see in the surveys is that the collapse in support for the government and for the international community is not matched by a corresponding increase in support for the Taliban. So it's not clear that they're reluctant to abandon this hope, which is still there to some extent, but they are now much more skeptical as to whether we can deliver.